Let us come into a calm, clear place where we can relinquish our clutter and relax from busyness into being. Let us settle into that calm, clear place where the earth supports our bodies and the community lifts our spirits, where we can breathe in peace and center ourselves in love. Let us welcome our calm, clear place where our hearts can open and our thoughts can expand beyond the cobwebs of convention into the creative flow of infinity.
Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Church of Baton Rouge. Whether you are joining us here in the sanctuary or joining us online, we're glad to have you with us. It's good to be together in the many ways that we do come together. And it's good to be together on this beautiful fall morning where it is rather colder here than it is in parts of the country where we'd expect that to be the opposite this morning. But welcome. I'm Reverend Eric Poza, interim minister, serving alongside our senior minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan, who will be in the pulpit next week. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by our intern minister, Leslie Runnels, our music director, Lee Hartman, on piano, and Mike Patton on our tech deck. There is so much that is happening in the life of our church as we are continuing our process of reopening this building. And we do invite you to stay after worship for the activities that will be happening outside in the courtyard during the middle hour of our service. We'll have some art and spiritual play, some conversation space, some other activities as well. So we hope many of you can join us for that. And those who are watching at home, if you're living relatively nearby, you're welcome to come up and join us after the service concludes as well. Also, for those who are newer to our community and are interested to learn more, perhaps you're starting to think about becoming a member of the congregation or have been thinking about it for some time, we have our prospective member class, our Roots class. Starting at the end of this month, it'll be a three-session class on Tuesday evenings, the first one November 30th, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So, if you want more information about that, please contact our church office or watch our emails. And it is good to be together. We welcome you. And we invite you to take something in now.
When the stock market crashed in 1929, there were two leading ready-to-eat cereal brands, Post and Kellogg. While people knew about oatmeal and cream of wheat, ready-to-eat cereal was still fairly new, so it wasn't clear whether the idea would survive the tanking economy. Post did what a lot of sensible households were doing, reined in their spending. But not Kellogg. They dramatically increased their investment, especially in marketing on the still new medium of radio. And by 1932, their sales had skyrocketed. Anyone who's ever heard Snap, Crackle, Pop has been influenced by that investment in moving boldly into uncertainty.
There are other stories of organizational risk-taking that didn't work as well, of course. But anyone who says that cutting costs in the face of uncertainty is always the wise thing isn't remembering that Post cereal paid for its timidity cloaked as sensibility. Any choice has trade-offs. Which trade-offs a congregation will make? That is the question.
My thanks to my colleague, Reverend Karen Johnson, who serves our UU congregation in East Brunswick, New Jersey, for providing and voicing that video. The words by another of our colleagues, Reverend Jake Morrill, who serves our church in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We gather together in so many ways as we worship together, and we invite all of you gathered in the sanctuary or online to join us in a ritual of expressing that coming together and that bringing together of what is on our hearts and minds. If you have something that you would share symbolically, we invite you in the sanctuary to come forward, at home to type in the chat something that symbolizes a stone, and those in the sanctuary placing the stone in the basin of our chalice. The table is open. Please come forward. And we light the flame in our chalice, the symbol of our freely covenanted Unitarian Universalist faith, saying together these words: with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is a symbol of the power of love. Jessie understood why she was starting to attend the Unitarian Universalist congregation in our community. As a queer woman, it was important for her to be in a community that affirmed her and who she was. And in many ways, that UU Church did, and certainly the values it espoused, the principles, its commitment to justice spoke deeply to her. And yet, as a person of color, as a woman of both African and Latinx heritage, she had a more mixed response, because the first time she visited the church, somebody asked her if she might be more comfortable at the Catholic church down the street. The second time, somebody asked if they could touch her hair. Note, if this is not clear, never do that, especially to somebody you've not met before. Please, trust me. That said, there was much good in the congregation, and she was glad to stay, even despite the concerns. And she got involved at a wider level. This was when there were districts, not just not the regions that we have now that are larger distinctions within our larger UU structure. And she got involved at the district level as well. And the first time she attended a district board meeting, somebody talking about an upcoming conference raised the concern that the meeting was going to be in a mixed neighborhood, quote unquote, and worried about the safety there. These microaggressions, we often call them, happen all too frequently. And Jesse was willing to respond, felt a need to respond, and painful though it was in some cases, helped to make some changes happen, helped to help the district board when she raised concerns to hear those objections. And even when she later went to seminary to study for the ministry and was presented the reading list, you know, the reading list, that those preparing for Unitarian Universalist ministry have to read, noticed that there were very few authors of color on the list, and objections from her and some other seminarians actually helped to change that list and broaden and diversify it. And yet, those awkward moments of being othered, as we say, those moments of being made to feel like the people around her didn't feel she belonged, still continued, even to the extent that the year she, following seminary and search for a congregation, interviewed with 5 different congregations. No one called her. There could be lots of reasons for that. And it's part of a pattern. A pattern that we are becoming uncomfortably, yet increasingly, and I would say, fortunately, more aware of in recent years. Because even though it does lead to uncomfortable moments, they're the kinds of uncomfortable moments that at their best can lead us to growth, can lead us to some positive and constructive change that help us to be more effective at, as we claim to be, being a welcoming congregation, not only to people of differing sexual orientations and gender identities, but differing races and abilities, ages, etc. And it's a question that's coming up more and more for a wide variety of reasons, and that has something to tell us, as well as some other factors that are affecting the likely future of our Unitarian Universalist faith. My colleague, Reverend Nathan Ryan, next Sunday will be talking, as I understand it, about the future of the church as an interim minister, as one who has traveled widely in UU circles, but is not, despite what some people sometimes think, an agent of the UUA sent here to force people into particular changes. No, I'm simply here to offer a broad perspective. which might help you to reflect on how this church in particular fits into that perspective. So in later parts of today's sermon, I'm going to invite us to think a little bit about how the context is changing, how the world around us is changing, and see what that might mean for us as Unitarian Universalists as we're moving into that future. And I'll say more about that right after this reading.
Today's young people tend to forego a single intact religious tradition in favor of a mix of sources from various traditions, religious and otherwise, to form and inform their beliefs and practices. For many young people, these sources likely include the philosophies of activists, scholars, clergy, and others who have fought for the causes that they're passionate about. With figures like Kimberly Crenshaw, Sylvia Rivera, Greta Thunberg, and Brian Stevenson informing their beliefs as much as prayer or scripture, we can conclude that fighting for the disenfranchised is not merely adjacent to Gen Z's beliefs and values. Rather, being informed and actionable about social justice is now the core of what they consider to be moral and faithful. With this in mind, we can expect that any religious group, or frankly any institution, that fails to pursue or support productive steps toward LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality, immigration rights, racial justice, will continue to have trouble appealing to Gen Z and gaining their trust.
Those words were from an article about a report recently published by an institution that does sociological research on what's coming to be called Generation Z. Would that there was a more unique term for it. I think it would be more fair to younger people to have a more authentic to themselves generational term. I say, speaking as a Gen Xer, the article was from an online religion news magazine, Religion Dispatches. It was published just a week and a half ago. And it has a long title, but a very telling one. Quote, Gen Z is turning away from religion in order to live out their values. And the author of that article, who was the CEO of the organization that did the study, is not the only one to see it. There was also a report that came out early last year from a commission formed by the Unitarian Universalist Association Board, the Commission on Institutional Change. It's a report called Widening the Circle of Concern. Now, there's much in that report, and there's too much to unpack completely today, but I do invite us to consider some of the trends that they identified, and these are some points that were made in that report. Our nation is moving away from institutional religion. According to the Pew Research Center, fewer people are participating in religious communities. Emerging generations report higher rates of people not affiliated with institutional forms of religion, and increasingly younger generations are the ones exiting religious institutions. And they add, while Unitarian Universalists often look at the slightly increasing number of people who identify as atheists and those who identify as not religious as an opportunity for us, some of the reasons for the exiting appear to be tied to the nature of religious institutions as much as changing beliefs. So there is quite a bit in the larger religious landscape that's changing in the 21st century. And they go on to note that Unitarian Universalism is not immune. We too are losing congregations and have many teetering on the edge of collapse. I don't think that's us, but it's worth noting as a trend. And they go on to add that while we typically refer to 1,000 congregations in the UUA, in truth, we now have 819 congregations that would meet the standard to become a congregation today. And I should add that report came out in February of 2020. So this is pre-pandemic, pre-lockdown, shutdown, certainly. The demographics of our nation, they go on to add, have changed, and with them, expectations around cultural competency. They note that we've seen an increase in the percentage of population that is non-white, and they name that there are 5 different states, including one of the states that Louisiana borders, the state of Texas, in which white people already are not the majority. And a growing number of people marry outside of their racial group. So the percentage of people who are multiracial is expected to increase significantly. And the globalization of economies and these demographic trends mean more people are exposed to cultural competency expectations in schools and the workplace, which implies that they're looking towards those from their religious communities as well. And they note that there are new generations facing a much bleaker future than those who are now at the end of their careers or in retirement. Lack of opportunity is felt by new generations, felt most by new generations, and this trend will be exacerbated by disinvestment in schools, rising cost of healthcare, etc. Income inequality affects younger people disproportionately. New generations no longer expect to achieve a higher quality of life than those before them, and there's a new level of despair caused by climate change, increased awareness of the problems of the world. It brings people into congregations and communities who are seeking a sustaining faith. So that's clearly part of the implications for us. Yes, it's a stark picture of a changing religious landscape, but it's one to consider how it affects Unitarian Universalism. And I think there's both bad news and good news there, both of which I'm going to unpack in a few minutes. But first, as we join together in this next hymn, first for those who are in the sanctuary, or if you're at home and you happen to have a hymnal at home, it's hymn number 145 in the gray hymnal, As Tranquil Streams. And I want to note there's an important history to this hymn. It was commissioned for the ceremony 60 years ago at which the Unitarian Church and the Universalist Church merged, formally consolidated to become the Unitarian Universalist Association. So let us join together in singing it masked now.
As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred hearts and minds unite to build a church that shall be
Please join us now in the spirit of prayer and quiet reflection. Close your eyes if that feels healing. Take some deep breaths as we focus inward. Spirit of life, love, and liberation, as we start looking forward, embracing our future, keep us aware that we are all connected in relationship. that when one of us is ignored and treated with dis-ease, we all suffer. Today, let each of us commit to welcome the stranger here and in our lives outside this sanctuary of beloveds. Let us move beyond our comfort zones and connect with people labeled different and pushed to the edges of society. We can make a difference. Liberation is our calling, our ministry, our vision, our future. We can transform lives. We can bring harmony and healing to the places and spaces where we live, work, and play. Let us keep our hearts and minds open and receptive to that still small voice that calls us to stand witness to those who cannot stand, to speak the truth for justice for those without a voice, and to lead the way on the journey towards wholeness for those without clear vision. In the spirit of collective liberation, may it be so. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.
Religion today faces a world not merely of transition, but of one revolutionary crisis following another, almost unbelievably rapidly. Political breakdown, economic paralysis, continental shifting of imperial powers stun the mind and spread disease. Our autonomic functions are not adjusted to the long view. The demands of the body are impatient and authentic. In view of this fact, religion is, in somewhat, the position of the physician by the bedside of the despairing patient, or of the social worker in a group of hungry and bewildered refugees. Undoubtedly, religion, like medicine, social work, and other institutional endeavors, must bend itself to the task of alleviating the suffering of now. Both religion and the world, however, are called to something more basic. That's the task of material alleviation and the binding of wounds. In the view of the widespread tragedy of our day and generation, religion has a basic task to perform. It calls it to a searching of heart, a painful search, which will perchance reveal ourselves to ourselves as we recreate a great heritage. We are all called upon to face anew elemental truths and to ask ourselves whether we have been wise and good stewards of these priceless treasures.
The reading was by Clarence Skinner, who was the foremost universalist theologian of the early and mid-20th century, before the consolidation with the Unitarians. But while he wrote those words at the end of World War II, the themes are just as relevant today. Political breakdown, economic paralysis, continental shifting of imperial power, stun the mind and spread disease. How relevant is this? And he adds that religion calls us to a searching of heart, a painful search which will perchance reveal ourselves to ourselves. And the good news, somewhat uncomfortable at moments, but good news is that for current day Unitarian Universalism, this search, is already underway. In the last few years especially, there has been a shift, a profound theological shift occurring throughout Unitarian Universalism, and it's one that parallels the broader shift in our religious culture that I described earlier. It also has some pretty real implications for the core commitments of our faith, for how we articulate them and how we live them out. And put broadly, it's a shift from liberal religion or liberal theology toward liberation theology. Now, what does that mean? So, broadly speaking, liberal theology and I'm quoting from the theologian Gary Dorian, attempts to reconceptualize the meaning of traditional teaching, he says traditional Christian teaching, he's an Episcopal priest, in the light of modern knowledge and modern ethical values. It is not revolutionary, but reformist in spirit and substance. And according to, of all sources, Encyclopedia Britannica, but I think this is quite accurate, it emphasizes a few things: confidence in human reason, primacy of the person, I would say of the individual person, immanence of God, that is to say, view of God not being distant from the world, and the belief that human nature is improvable and is improving. These are threads that are incredibly common, incredibly well known in Unitarian Universalist circles as well. It's sometimes been argued that we are the most liberal of Christian traditions, so liberal that we liberalized ourselves right out of Christendom. That's debated. I'm not saying that's the right view, but it's one I've heard, and I can certainly see why people view it that way. But it's also interesting to note that taking this liberal theological approach to its extreme means taking a view of religion which is at least somewhat abstract. The way this was expressed in past decades in Unitarian Universalism, one way that was particularly influential was, and this comes from a Unitarian historian of the mid-20th century, identifying the three main themes of our religious history as freedom, reason, and tolerance. Some of you who are longtime members of this church may remember a time 20 years ago when I served as your intern that those three words were on banners in the parking lot of this church. And for its time, those were very authentic and appropriate ways of understanding our faith tradition. And it's also worth noting that they're not fully up to the task for our new religious context and our new social context in which we meet the world. And that's, I think, why this shift is happening towards liberation theology. Liberation theology, and here I'm quoting a theologian named Anthony Bradley, is a theology applied to the core concerns of marginalized communities in need of social, political, or economic equality and justice. And it's emerged in particular ways in different contexts. The terms often associated with the poor in Latin America, where the phrase liberation theology first caught on. But there is also a school of thought known as Black liberation theology, most originally championed by a theologian named James Cone, who just passed in the last year or two. And feminist theology often meets this as well. So does what's sometimes called queer theology, coming out of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer communities. This is not radically different, necessarily, from liberal theology. There is some overlap, and there are theologians that have bridged the gap effectively. I would argue the most effective one at doing that is the most influential public theologian of the last century, Martin Luther King Jr., who was deeply grounded in his theological training in liberal theology and continued to hold true to many aspects of it. So much so that as a young person, it has since been admitted by his spouse, Coretta Scott King, that the two of them actually seriously considered when he was in graduate school converting to Unitarianism. But they also quickly realized that they would be completely ineffective in a Unitarian context at helping to organize a mass movement of Black people. It's an almost direct quote from Coretta speaking to a colleague of mine some years ago. And yet there are differences here because liberation theology, unlike the more abstract liberal theology, is deeply contextual. It does play out in different ways. And it's a conversation that's emerging in UU circles in a lot of ways. Some of it's talked about in that report I mentioned, Widening the Circle of Concern. It's also being talked about in the movement to add an 8th principle. Some of you know that there are nationally 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism identified as part of the covenant of member congregations. But there's a movement to add an 8th, which speaks to anti-racism and anti-oppression as a core commitment of our faith. So if we're shifting from being a liberal religion only to being a liberationist faith that comes out of a liberal tradition, what then does the future of our faith look like? Well, I see 2 options. One of the options is negative, but one of them is quite positive. And I could honestly see it going either way. One of the options is that we fail to live into our new context, that we continue to hold so closely to our old ways of doing things that it becomes clear to people like Jesse, who I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon, that we're not really living into all of the commitments that we espouse. And if we do that, we're going to become, I predict, increasingly irrelevant, increasingly unsuccessful at retaining those who visit or explore our churches, and that's going to lead to us dwindling in vibrancy, dwindling in communal health, dwindling in resources, and dwindling in size. That's one option. The other option is to meet these changing times. It's to be increasingly affirming of the needs and the leadership of people of color, of queer and especially trans people, of people of different abilities and neurodiversity, and I say this as somebody who's about to turn 50 years old, of young adults. How we lift up that culture of broad welcome. A culture that gently but clearly resists the microaggressions and the other ways we subtly privilege the status quo, often without realizing or intending to do so, and the ways in which we develop a culture that lives true to our proclaimed values, both within and beyond our walls. In other words, how we Unitarian Universalists truly can be who we say we are and do as we say we do. That, I think, is the crux. And how specifically we do that, well, I'll conclude with that in a few minutes.
As
First, a quick process note to our ushers today. In just a moment, as soon as I'm done speaking, we're going to show a quick video, and we'll begin to collect the offering immediately as that video ends. And the video is, in fact, related to our offering, because this is an opportunity for us to share in a tangible way with one another, but not only for the continued good works of this congregation, also for others. We do have the tradition, which we've expanded in recent months, that every Sunday now we are sharing our plate, sharing our offering with an organization in the community that's doing good works in harmony with our Unitarian Universalist values. And the organization that we're sharing with in the month of November is the organization you're about to hear more about in this video, after which the offering will be gratefully received.
Youth Oasis is a youth services agency that provides housing and resources to transition-age youth. Our primary population includes youth in supervised care settings, such as foster care and juvenile detention. We specialize in providing services to LGBTQ+ youth and older youth of color. We provide transitional living homes within the community, and we are excited to announce the opening of a young adult shelter and drop-in center in December. We thank you for your continued support and welcome your ideas and suggestions for being better neighbors to our youth in Baton Rouge.
I'm speaking of the importance of UU faith and ministry meeting our context. Well, that plays out in a couple of different ways, because our context is changing, has changed, but there is, of course, a very dramatic change in recent context that hasn't been mentioned, the pandemic. I appreciate our senior minister, Reverend Nathan Ryan, who has what should be trademarked term, the stupid pandemic, to refer to it. I think it's a very appropriate term. But that means that our future context is both short-term and long-term, and the two are slightly different. For the short-term future and living into it, I think there's some truths that's important for us to continue to recognize, and I really appreciated how they were named last month in a column by Natalie Briscoe, who is the lead staff member for the Southern Region UUA staff team. She articulated a few truths that she wanted us to hear, and the first one is, and I quote, "This sucks." Flat out. We are dealing, she says, with a situation we did not sign up for. We're forced to solve problems that no one prepared us for. Another truth, there is nothing wrong with you. I know it feels like everything is wrong with you, but I assure you, it isn't you that's wrong, it is the world. And since there is nothing wrong with you, nothing will fix you. There is no workshop, training, or webinar that is going to take the anxiety out of your congregation. People are short. They're on edge and easily hurt. And she notes that I know what you want anything is to take the pain away, but that is mere distraction. And then she encourages, don't turn on each other, turn to each other. We're all we've got. Give everyone else the grace you need. Anxiety and unease makes us short with one another, and we look to conflict to release the pressure that we feel. But if we resist this urge, we can lean into one another and become communities of support and resilience. Two other points she makes. One is, you don't have to do anything. Nothing is required. The only thing we have to do right now as churches is take care of one another. Our only obligation is to love one another. And she adds that an easy escape from the pain we feel is to take on a bunch of projects and attempt to plan a large slate of programming. You'll soon find that you are halfway into the plan and cannot maintain it. And she concludes, we love you and we're sorry. And she asks that congregations call on the Southern Region staff for support. And I think those are wise suggestions and reminders for this short term, for whatever is left of this in-between time of this pandemic. But long term, living fully into these broader changes that were already happening around us well before the pandemic started. I think the best news is that while we sometimes fall short of them, Unitarian Universalism nonetheless has resources that are core to our faith, to who it is we are as people of faith and as a faith community. And these resources, the more we lean into them and the more we work to actualize them, the better equipped we're going to be to meet these changing times, to become the kinds of congregations and communities that people of many different races, orientations, gender identities, ages, abilities, etc., are going to come into and feel authentically welcoming. And one of those is hospitality. Now, hospitality is a core commitment of so many religious traditions. But it plays out in particular ways for us Unitarian Universalists because we have a long tradition of becoming gradually more welcoming to those that have previously not been welcome elsewhere and perhaps earlier had not even been welcome in our circles. Our original ambiguity around slavery, advocating against it in the 19th century, while a lot of members of our prominent Boston churches were profiting from the slave trade nonetheless, changed to an authentic embrace of abolishing slavery. Our advocacy for LGBTQ people, which decades ago was rare in any religious community, but ours was among the first to begin advocating for this, as the Welcoming Congregation program that this congregation is part of certainly makes clear. Continuing to extend that hospitality in ways that are authentic and welcoming, and which encourage us to understand what things we do that truly do welcome and what things we do that get in the way of welcoming others. Doing that kind of self-reflection is going to equip us well. Another of the core resources, covenant. We say that we are a faith of covenant over creed. That doesn't just mean we don't have a list of beliefs that you have to ascribe to or some other list of beliefs that you can't ascribe to. It means that belief is not the defining factor in our religious community. What defines us is the promises we make to each other about how we're going to be together, how we're going to be in relationship with one another, how we're going to live out our values within our community and amongst ourselves. That's true to those values. That's true to those commitments. And it implies that when we fall short of those commitments, as all of us will at times, we have a mechanism for being invited back into it. I've been having some great conversations with our Healthy Congregations Committee here at the church about how we can promote a more covenantal way of being together as we're coming back together physically as well as virtually, and how we are living out our faith in new ways in that coming together. I'm looking forward to that conversation unfolding. And of course, the other of the core commitments I'm talking about is justice, which has been so deeply important to us for so long. And we are increasingly realizing that advocating for justice in the world, yes, it does mean advocating for policy changes in Baton Rouge and the parish and the state of Louisiana. And also, it means advocating for more justice within our walls and amongst ourselves also. And when we inadvertently or unconsciously, or in rarer cases, consciously get in the way of being a more just community, then again, we have something to call us back, to invite us to be more authentic in those relationships. Jessie, who I talked about at the beginning of the service, did not leave, even though her ministry in its early days was challenged. She eventually found her way to serving as an associate minister at a church where she was working with a senior minister who was willing to stay accountable to the concerns and the ways that we, including that senior minister, sometimes falls short of what we proclaim and what we profess. And that's the best we can ask of any of us, because we're all going to make mistakes. And pointing those mistakes out does not mean that you're a bad person. It means you made a mistake. The question is, to what extent do we respond? To ask Jake Morrell's question from the end of the lesson again, which choices are we as a congregation to make? I think we have an incredible opportunity to make choices that are not only going to serve us well, but are going to serve Baton Rouge and this community well, and especially will serve well those who have yet to join us, but may in the future be looking for a community where their values and the whole of their personhood is affirmed. And I have no doubt that we can be, and that all of our churches can be, those welcoming, affirming communities. And it's that faith, even as it's shifting, that continues to give me hope in the days ahead. So may it be for us all. Amen. Now, we have another hymn to sing. And this one, again, for those who are gathered or have a hymnal at home, it's in your gray hymnal. It's number 318. And this one, too, has a history, because a few years before the Unitarians and the Universalists as a whole consolidated with one another, the youth groups merged earlier to form a joined group called Liberal Religious Youth. And this is the hymn that was written to honor that joining together. We would be one. Let us sing together.
Please stand. We would be one as now we join in singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves infinite meaning, which binds our hearts and points us on our way, is when we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
And so, as we go forth from this sacred time and place, may our lives be graced with blessings of freedom and wholeness. For though our worship now ends, so begins anew our service. Let us go forth from the many places where we have gathered and serve this hurting world in the spirit of love. Thank you for joining with us. Please join us outside and go in peace.